In this video, I'm going to show you how to install a brand new fork on a bicycle. And by brand new, I mean one that has an uncut steerer tube. Installing a fork, especially when you include the headset, requires some of the most specialized tools of any kind of bike maintenance. So you're either going to need to make an investment in these tools or have access to them either through your local bike shop or a friend. Some of the things that you're going to need for this are: one, you're going to need a Crown Race setter. And I don't have one here because I did this job at my local shop, but I'll tell you where that comes into play in a minute. You're also going to need a cutting guide and a hacksaw to cut the steerer tube. You can also use a tube cutter like this and also a file to file off the rough edges. Now you can only use this if you have an aluminum steerer tube. If your fork has a carbon steerer tube, then you have to use a cutting guide and a hacksaw. You cannot use a tube cutter on a carbon steerer tube. If you have an aluminum steerer tube, most likely you're going to have what's called a star-fangled nut that goes inside that holds your top cap. So you're also going to need this star nut setter. Your first step is to install the Crown Race setter. And the Crown Race is just this little race that comes probably with your headset. And I have already done this, and I did it at the bike shop because I did not have a Crown Race setter. And a Crown Race setter is just a big tube with an adapter on the end that you can change out for various size Crown Races. So all you do is you add some grease to the steerer tube, put the Crown Race, slide it down the shaft of the fork, and then pound it down until it comes all the way flush with the fork. So that is your first step. All right, our next step is to actually install the fork on the bicycle with the stem and all the bearings so we can find out where we need to cut the steerer tube. So I'm going to slide my bottom bearing on the fork, and when the bottom bearing goes on, the flattest portion faces down on top of the Crown Race. Slide the fork inside the bike. Next, I've already actually got my top bearing in the top head cup, and that goes with the flattest portion facing up. Next, I'm going to install this washer that will fit down inside the bearing, and then the cap that goes on the bearing, and those usually have an O-ring inside that keeps moisture out of the headset, and you sometimes have to really force this down on top of the steerer tube. Okay, now I'm going to put on as many spacers as I think I'm going to need, and it's better to go with too many spacers than not enough. So I'm going to put on, for this bike, I'm going to do 3 spacers with the stem, of course. Okay, now I've got my spacers on. Make sure everything's pushed down, the top cap, all your spacers and stem. And I'll just take an Allen wrench. This particular stem requires a 4. So I'm just going to tighten the stem bolts just a little bit to hold everything together. The next thing I'm going to do is just take something to put a little mark on the steerer tube. I'm going to use just a box knife. So I'm going to just go right above that spacer and make my mark. Okay, you can see that I have a mark here now on the steerer tube. And you've heard the expression measure twice, cut once, and this definitely applies to installing a fork. You really want to make sure everything is put together right. In other words, everything's pressed down. You've got all the spacers on that you want to use, and you've got your stem, of course, installed. So I've verified that the mark is good. Now I'm going to take everything out, lay it aside, and it's time to cut the steerer tube. Okay, so here is my mark. Now I'm going to put this in the cutting guide, but let me show you this first. Is when you actually do the cut, you want to cut about 2 to 3 millimeters below the mark. And the reason is, if you don't, the top cap, when you tighten it down, is going to bottom out on the fork and not tighten up the headset like you want. So you cannot cut right on the mark. You want to cut maybe, again, about 2 to 3 millimeters below that mark. Okay, I've got the fork in the cutting guide, and when you use a cutting guide, make sure you put the fork on the side that tightens down on top of the fork. That way, when your cut is made, the end will drop off and not your fork. Now, always use safety glasses whenever you're cutting. And when you're cutting carbon, wear a mask over your face because you do not want to breathe carbon dust. It's also a good idea to wrap a carbon fork in one layer of masking tape, or even painter's tape will work. That will keep the dust to a minimum and will also keep the carbon from fraying when you cut. Okay, I'm ready to cut. I'm going to put on my safety glasses. Okay, when I put the blade on the cutting guide, I can look through and I can see my mark. And I'm just verifying that the blade is indeed about 3 millimeters below my mark, so I'm ready to cut. Okay, and there it is. Okay, now that I have my cut made, I'm going to take a file, and you definitely have to do this if you use a tube cutter, and you should also do it when you cut as well with a cutting guide. So I'm going to take the file and just go around the outside and just smooth that off so that my bearings or especially your spacers and that bearing cap will fit on smoothly. And I also have this type of file that goes on the inside, and I'm going to go around and just get any burrs off with this as well. Okay, now that I've got my edges smooth, I'm just going to take a paper towel. I've got some rubbing alcohol on here. I'm going to just get off some of that dust. And then I also have access to an air compressor, so I'm just going to blow out the steerer tube, get as much of that dust out as I can. Okay, now it's time to install the star-fangled nut. And this will be included with your fork, sometimes your headset, and oftentimes both. Now let me show you that I took a towel and wrapped it around the fork. So I've got a bike light on because it's getting dark out. And the reason that I've done this is you don't want the installation of this to slip either with the hammer or actually have the star nut not go in and you drop the tool, because that would scratch your fork. And if it sounds like I'm speaking from experience, I am. The last thing you want to do is scratch up your brand new fork before you even put it on the bike. So I've wrapped it in a towel just with some duct tape, and now I'm going to install the star-fangled nut. Okay, so I take the tool, I thread this onto the tool. Make sure it's all the way down. And now I'm just going to hold it above the fork, and I'm going to hit it with a hammer until it goes down inside. So we're going to hold it on there real good, and then take a hammer and hammer it on. Now, I also have a towel underneath the fork. Sometimes I'll even do this on the grass to avoid the bottom of the fork getting scratched on pavement. So you definitely want to put something very soft underneath. Okay, as it's going on, you want to put some pressure on one side of the tool to make it straighten out. So this is kind of twisting on that direction. So I'm going to put some pressure on, force it back over to the middle. And you go all the way down until the shoulders of the star-fangled nut tool come all the way down flush with the fork. Okay, so that's all the way in. And now I just twist the tool out and it unfades. Now I've got the star-fangled nut inside, and all it's time to do now is to put everything back together, back on the bike. Okay, got my bearings in, spacer, stem. I'm gonna take my top cap and thread that on. And I didn't show it in the video, but I had to take the fork back out and file the top of the steer tube a little bit more to, I couldn't feel it, but I guess there was a little bit of a burr that was preventing this bearing cap from going on. So, once I have the top cap in place, that's it for the fork installation. Now it's just time for this project to keep building the bike. Now, one other tip, you'll see that I kept the plastic on the fork, and I usually do this until I get to the point where it's time to put the brakes on. That way it just protects the fork while I'm going through this process. Okay, that's it for the fork installation. Thanks for watching.